Everyone clapped as Sarah stepped off the stage, her tearful speech about donating a kidney echoing through the hall. But it was my kidney. She'd forced me to stay silent, threatening to reveal my past if I spoke. Piper squeezed my hand under the table, eyes wide. That was 6 months ago. Today, Sarah's lies are crumbling, and I'm ready to speak. Subscribe so you don't miss what's next. Sarah first approached me during a staff lunch. All sugary charm, she called me a hero for volunteering to donate, and said she'd make sure people knew. I believed her. We shared shifts, inside jokes, late-night texts. When Piper mentioned Sarah's obsession with media attention, I shrugged it off. My therapist warned me about boundaries, but I wanted to feel needed for once, to matter to someone who saw me. 3 days before surgery, Sarah panicked. She cried in my apartment, clutching her abdomen, claiming anxiety. It has to be you, Claire, she whispered. You're stronger. I nodded. Believing we were bonded, the next day I signed the release anonymous donor. She promised to tell the truth after. Piper hesitated when I told her, but said nothing. At home, my mother said I was finally doing something useful. I ignored the sting. The hospital newsletter featured Sarah's story, Selfless Bride Saves Fiancé. My chest tightened. My name wasn't mentioned once. Piper caught me staring. You okay? She asked gently. I lied. Later, I overheard Sarah laughing with the pre-rep, planning an Instagram collab. Let them believe it, she said. That night, I tore the newsletter into pieces, at dinner. My dad praised that brave Sarah. I excused myself, hands shaking under the table. Sarah started doing podcast interviews. Her voice filled the break room, recounting her journey and the fear. I clenched my coffee cup. Piper leaned in. That's your story, I nodded. But my stomach churned. Sarah caught my eye later, smirking like we shared a joke. That night, I called my therapist, voice trembling. Why can't I speak up? I whispered. She reminded me silence was learned and could be unlearned. I barely slept. Sarah announced her engagement party invites hand delivered. Mine slipped into my locker. Wouldn't be the same without you, she chirped. I stared at the glittery envelope. Piper frowned. She's flaunting it. I forced a smile. That weekend, social media exploded with her white dress photo shoot captioned Survivor and Savior. The comments flooded in hero, angel, inspiration. My hands shook. At home, I shoved my phone in a drawer. My chest felt hollow. A reporter emailed me, wanted to verify Sarah's story. My heart pounded. I deleted it. Later, I found Piper by my locker, holding the same email on her phone. They're asking questions, she said. You should answer. But I froze. Sarah passed by, eyes narrowed. Be careful, she mouthed. I felt like a child again, punished for speaking. That night, I practiced telling the truth in front of a mirror. My lips trembled. Piper invited me to a small gathering. Just friends, no Sarah talk. But halfway through, someone said, Isn't your coworker the kidney bride? Everyone turned to me. My face burned. She's not what you think, I muttered. Silence followed. Later, Piper handed me a cup of tea. You don't know her, your silence. I nodded, eyes brimming. That night, I opened my old journals. My story, every detail was there, waiting to be used. At the engagement party, I arrived late on purpose. Sarah's eyes flickered when she saw me. Didn't think you'd come, she said sweetly. I held her gaze. I'm not here for you. I pulled out a folded paper and laid it on the cake table. My anonymous donor release form, highlighted. Guests whispered. Piper stepped beside me, her presence a shield. Sarah's fiancé looked confused. Claire, he asked. My voice shook, but I replied clearly. Ask her who really saved his life. Sarah grabbed my arm, nails digging in. You don't want to do this, she hissed. I pulled free. I already did, I said. Piper moved closer. Everyone deserves the truth. Sarah's mother asked, What's going on? I turned to the crowd. Sarah didn't donate that kidney, I did. She forced me into silence. Gasps rippled through the room. Sarah's fiancé looked stunned. Tell them I'm lying, I dared her. She opened her mouth but no words came. Just silence. Sarah fled into the hallway. I followed, heart racing. Why, I demanded. She whirled around. Because no one ever looked at me like they looked at you that day. I wanted to matter. My throat tightened. So you lied? Use me, she laughed bitterly. You let me. Piper stepped beside me, phone in hand. We recorded your confession. Sarah's face drained of color. For the first time, I saw fear in her eyes, not mine. I turned and walked away. The next morning, a video clip of Sarah's outburst surfaced online. Piper's doing. Comments exploded. Some defended her. Others demanded accountability. I watched silently. Then an email popped up. The reporter again. This time, they had seen the footage. Would you like to share your side now? I hesitated, fingers hovering. Piper texted me. You deserve this. I clicked reply. My story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a reckoning. Sarah issued a statement apologizing vaguely, blaming emotional trauma, but Piper forwarded a message from one of Sarah's past roommates. She's done this before, a pattern, a habit. I added it to the email chain with the reporter. Days later, an expose ran. Falls here are the real story behind a viral kidney donation. My name was there finally. Sarah's face was blurred, but the truth crystal clear. I reread it twice, heart pounding, hand steady. Sarah's fiancé called off the wedding. I don't know who she is, he said, visibly shaken, when a local news crew caught him outside his office. Meanwhile, Piper and I met at our usual coffee shop. She raised her cup to reclaiming your name. I smiled small, but real. Behind us, someone whispered, That's Claire Maddox. I didn't shrink. I stood taller. I wasn't a secret anymore. I was a survivor with my voice intact. Hospital leadership called me in. I expected backlash. Instead, they offered thanks. You showed courage. The director said, they planned a new policy, transparent donor acknowledgements. I nodded, overwhelmed. Piper squeezed my shoulder. You started something. As I left the office, I passed Sarah in the hallway. She looked away. I didn't. For once, I didn't flinch. I was done hiding. The hospital wasn't just where I worked. It was where I reclaimed my power. A support group for medical trauma survivors reached out. They'd read the article and wanted me to speak. My hands trembled as I typed yes. The night of the meeting, I stood before a small crowd, nurses, patients, caretakers. This isn't about revenge, I began. It's about truth. Faces nodded back. Piper sat front row, eyes shining. As I spoke, the shame unraveled. I wasn't just telling my story, I was giving others permission to tell theirs. Sarah tried to launch a new blog rebranding herself as an advocate for invisible trauma, but comments flooded in, citing the expose. She deleted her account within days. Meanwhile, the support group invited me back, this time to co-lead a session. Piper called it poetic justice. I called it healing. Sarah faded from the spotlight she stole, and I finally stood in my own light, brighter, fiercer, untouchable, no longer afraid of being seen. An intern nervously approached me during a shift. Is it true, she asked? I nodded, her eyes welled. Thank you for speaking up. I hadn't realized how far my voice carried. Piper joked later. You're kind of a legend. I laughed genuinely. I'd once felt like a shadow, eclipsed by others' lies. Now, I was a beacon. Quiet strength had become visible, and the people who needed to see it. They finally did. My mother sent a letter handwritten where she apologized. I never saw how much it cost you, she wrote. I sat with it for hours. Piper read it aloud for me. You deserved more than silence. Tears came, not bitter ones, but the kind that washed something clean. I wrote back, not for her but for me. Boundaries, truth, a line drawn in ink. I'd learned to speak, and now I chose when and how. One afternoon I visited the transplant wing. A young girl waited with her mom, nervously twirling her bracelet. I smiled and said, You're braver than you know. Her mom asked if I was a nurse. I nodded, but Piper added, She's also a donor. The girl's eyes widened. Thank you. That single word settled deep in me. I'd spent months feeling erased. No, one voice, soft, honest, had rewritten it all. Recognition, finally, without pretending or pain. Piper organized a casual panel at the hospital, stories from the other side. I hesitated, but agreed. When I stood at the podium, nerves buzzing, I spotted familiar faces, colleagues, patients, even the intern. I shared only what I chose, no more. When I stepped down, applause followed, not for drama, but for truth. Piper whispered, You did it. I smiled. Not all victories are loud. Some arrive softly, echoing in the spaces we once feared. A local artist painted a mural outside the hospital, figures standing tall. A kidney-shaped heart glowing between them. I paused in front of it one morning. At the bottom, in soft script, donors are heroes too. Piper joined me. Coffee in hand, they saw you, she said. I didn't speak, just nodded. Recognition doesn't always come in headlines. Sometimes it blooms in colors on brick walls, in quiet places that finally say, You matter. A medical ethics class invited me to guest speak. I almost declined, but remembered how silence once ruled me. Standing before students, I told my story without embellishment. Truth matters, I said. One student raised her hand. What would you tell someone afraid to speak? I paused. Your voice is your own. Use it before someone else does. Piper later said it hit hard. I felt it too in the quiet after applause. The hospital held a donor appreciation day. For the first time, my name was called. I stepped forward, heart pounding. The applause wasn't thunderous, but it was real. I accepted a small plaque, inscribed with, For the unseen gift. Piper teared up. Took them long enough, she whispered. I clutched it. Not for validation but for memory, of silence broken, of worth recognized. I didn't need a stage, but it felt good to stand on one anyway. A letter arrived from Sarah's fiancé. I'm sorry I believed her. Thank you for saving my life. I read it twice, hands steady. He enclosed a small photo, him volunteering at a donor awareness event. Not forgiveness, not friendship, but acknowledgement. Piper framed the note for me. Proof, she said. I nodded. Some wounds don't close with apologies, but with honesty. And this was honest. It didn't erase the past, but it honored it. One night, I passed Sarah at a grocery store. She looked older, hunched. Our eyes met. No words, no scenes, just recognition and difference. She turned away. I walked on. Piper later asked how it felt, like closing a book I never chose to open. I said it wasn't revenge. It wasn't closure. It was clarity. I didn't need her guilt. I'd written my ending, and it was stronger than her silence ever was. I found an old photo, me and Sarah. Pre-surgery, arms linked. I nearly tossed it. Instead, I wrote on the back, She silenced me. I chose to speak. I kept it tucked in my journal. Not as a wound but a record. Piper said, That's healing, and maybe it was. Pain doesn't vanish, it reshapes. That photo, once a lie, now told a deeper truth. Not of betrayal, but of survival, of who I became despite her. I visited the hospital garden, where I used to sit post-shift. Exhausted, invisible, now benches bore donor names. Mine was there too. I traced the engraved letters. Claire Maddox, no title, no qualifiers, just me. Piper appeared with 2 coffees. I figured you'd want to see it alone. I smiled. Not alone, not anymore. I sat, breathing deep. The world didn't change overnight. But in this quiet bloom of recognition, something had finally rooted. I sat at my kitchen table. Sunlight spilling over my journal, the same one I'd hidden after surgery, now open. Filled. Piper's words echoed. You wrote it first. I touched the page where I'd scrawled. My silence wasn't consent. My voice had once felt like a flicker. Now it burned steady. Sarah's shadow no longer followed me. My mother's silence no longer defined me. I whispered, I'm here, and for the first time, I truly was. Piper and I walked the hospital hallway, her bed swinging beside mine. You're different now, she said. I shrugged, but she stopped me. You don't apologize for existing anymore. That landed deep. We paused by the mural. I reached out, fingertips brushing the painted kidney heart. That's not just art, I said. It's a witness, she smiled. To who you are. I nodded. The pain hadn't disappeared, but now, it had a place, and so did I. The hospital newsletter published a follow-up. This time, my name was front and center. Claire Maddox, the true donor. Sarah's name was absent. No retaliation, just facts. Piper showed me the draft before print. You good with this? She asked. I read it slowly. Yeah, It wasn't vengeance, it was visibility. A quiet truth correcting a loud lie. I didn't need applause, just acknowledgement. And now, it was mine. Not stolen, not silenced, just mine. I opened a new journal. The cover bright teal, Piper's gift. Inside, I wrote, Today, I begin again. No more writing from pain. Just possibility. I didn't erase the past, I honored it. Page by page. My name was no longer something I whispered. It was something I lived. Piper hugged me before her shift. You built this life. I smiled. And I'll keep building. The scars remained, but so did my strength. My story wasn't over. It had just begun. Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe to check out more stories on my channel.